Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your doomin' boy, Abram Buhner, joined by my gloomin' co-host, Tucker Hazel, and today we're here to talk about how video games are dead and dying, and it's all going to hell. But before we do, I want to remind you that you should subscribe to the channel, and you should like the video, you should leave a comment down in the comments section. But Tucker, I've been feeling this sort of motion in the ocean that I want to talk about with you.
Yeah.
Because after the PlayStation Showcase, after the string of apology posts that various
Yes.
developers shot out on social media yesterday, there's been a lot of conversation percolating about how maybe the industry is not going in such a positive direction. So I want to talk with you
Yeah.
about that today, but it's not just you and I having this conversation because there's one plug I left out. You can also talk to us about this topic in our Discord, as many of our friends did, who are actually sort of going to be guiding the conversation, like our friend Virtual Eric, who said the following, Tucker. Quote, I've never been so bored with modern gaming than the last 2 years. Nothing
Mm.
interests me, and everything either looks the same or is destined to shut down after 6 months. I enjoyed playing Super Bomberman R Online, Pac-Man 99, and Mario 35, but you can't play them anymore. Most of the newer games I play on my newer consoles are ports, remasters, and compilations of older, pre-existing IP.
Mm.
Tucker,
Mm.
synthesize the state of play that I sort of set out for you. Synthesize Eric's perspective, and let me know how you're feeling about this conversation.
Well, what's interesting about all the negative comments that, frankly, did not start. They did not start with the state of play. They did not
No,
start with yesterday's string of apology posts as a recording. These kind of sentiments about the AAA games industry, the games industry as a whole, sort of trending downwards, microtransactions, games launching incomplete. This is a conversation that I think has kind of always existed, at least in
yeah,
some form or fashion. And it's evolved over the years as different examples of games like Cyberpunk releasing in the state that it did, Nintendo releasing many games that have their content sort of backfilled, as we've talked about a couple times on this channel. But because that conversation has always existed, I have never felt it really grow for me personally.
sure,
And instead, what I choose to focus on and where I sort of will push back against this negative sentiment is the games industry as a whole, not as necessarily just Ubisoft and EA and Blizzard are shitheads, because they are. And they don't really make games that I love, so it doesn't bother me too much that they're shitheads.
sure,
But the games industry is so much more than that. And I think that on the whole, when I'm looking at the list of games that I play each year, when I'm watching conferences that announce a wide breadth of games or the variety of conferences that we have, I choose to come down on the more positive side because I see the forest for the trees here. I see a couple of really fucking shitty trees, ones that are falling down, ones that are
right,
rotting. But on the whole, I see a lot more good than I do bad, and I'm able to sort of reconcile these sort of industry economic realities of like corporate nonsense and introducing microtransactions and charging people for a bunch of horse shit. But that's not the majority of the games industry. And I do think on the whole, I have watched the games industry blossom into something where there's a lot more avenues for kinds of games, types of games, different kinds of creators. And that's what I choose to focus on when I think of the games industry. And because I don't play too many games that I don't like, and frankly, on a very subjective level, a lot of the games that have the worst issues of the modern games industry aren't the kind of games that I play in general.
sure.
The negative elements of the games industry don't really factor too much into my personal thoughts about how happy am I with games now. Okay, I didn't play any of the games that got shut down. Of course, many people do/did, so that is certainly something that we'll have to wrestle with here. But on a very subjective level, the problems with the modern games industry just don't really enter into the dozens and dozens, if not in total hundreds of games per year that I play.
Yeah, it's interesting because when Eric says he's never been so bored with modern gaming in the last 2 years, I'm just not necessarily sure I agree with the general premise. I
Yeah.
think where I come down on the topic, as you know, Tucker, is that I'm sort of generally just interested with a lot of the AAA games that come out,
Yeah,
particularly
even the best
Western.
ones.
Yeah, even the best ones,
Yeah,
especially Western AAA. I'm
yeah.
usually not too big of a fan of, even though I tend to try a lot of things only to be reminded, oh yeah, it's not really for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is I think that sometimes we get so many things conflated. We get our own taste conflated. We get sort of isolated
Mm.
trends conflated. And we end up having this more negative outlook on the entirety of the space and is maybe warranted. And this is sort of the
Yeah, I
nuance I
agree.
want to introduce into the conversation because I've been thinking about this last couple of days. We've been soliciting, I think we have about 10 comments that we'll talk about. They'll lead us in various directions. I've been separating the point for me in two ways.
Yeah.
I think that the medium, the artistic medium of video games, is in a wonderful position. I think it has a very, very bright future.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the video games industry has a lot of very distinct challenges that are maybe holding back some of this creative potential, as I
Sure.
want to talk about. But for me, I think both those things can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
So when you see people on Twitter after the PlayStation Showcase saying, "Oh, everything looks the same, man. All these games have the same brooding protagonist and the gun and the same aesthetic or whatever they have to say." I just think it's reductive to try to conflate all of these things about what games are, what they can be, and then maybe sort of the economic
Yeah.
realities, the structural realities that we'll talk about that are maybe, pushing down some of that creative expression that
Sure.
nonetheless is still very, very visible across all
Absolutely.
scales of game development, even if it might not always seem to be the most obvious, as I want to touch on.
Yeah.
So, Tucker, I think we should just start following some of these avenues
Sure. Sure.
that our friends in the Discord have laid out for us. Is there one in particular you want to start with?
Um. Well, there's one that I want to end with. How about that? Does that
Okay,
help?
sure. Well, there's one I'll hop into now, if you oblige me.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this notion that our friend Abby raises, who says,
Aha.
I think games are going to have a rough patch upcoming simply due to the slowdown in innovation. However, I think this will be good as more focus will be placed on things such as art style, game mechanics, and story. I think that we'll start to place less
Hmm.
emphasis on graphics and realism and more on how fun a game is when being played. I think
Yeah.
TOTK, Tears of the Kingdom, opened my eyes up to this, as the game is pure fun even though I'm playing it on my small 720p Switch screen with constant frame rate drops. I still enjoy the game much more than some other releases that look and perform much better but are lacking in terms of mechanics and art style. Basically, to
Yeah.
wrap up, I think a lot more emphasis will be placed on making more fun creative games as console tech starts to plateau. Now, I don't necessarily agree with what Abby's saying here.
Hmm.
What do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting is
Yeah,
we've sort of talked about in some of our recent videos about something needs to give in terms of where the games industry is
right.
trending. Things budgets are ballooning. The game development time are continuing to get larger and larger, making it harder for games to be profitable and ultimately make the giant companies money, which is what all this shit is actually for at the end of the day.
Right.
Um, but I do think that a interesting point that games history has never had to purely deal with is the plateauing of technical innovation. I don't think he's talking about necessarily innovation on a gameplay side, though I think that does come with the technical innovation, but how each console gets progressively less and less different than the last. And
Yeah.
the PS4 and PS5 share 90% of their library. Of course, that will shift as time goes on, but I think when you look at the amount of games that are shared between each generation, especially the cross generational games
Yeah.
primarily, getting more and more that the console generations overlap and the amount of technical difference that you're getting between PS4, PS3, and PS4 is a lot greater than it is with PS4 and PS5. And I do think that that will have some sort of effect on the way that games are designed once the point reaches that we have all the engines established. We have all these different textures and models that have been becoming more and more popular and easy to access through things like Unreal Engine. Uh, at a certain point, of course, progress will still be made, but it has to slow just by the nature of how technology works, every technology reaches that sort of plateau where until something completely new happens, if VR ends up taking over at some point in the future normal console gaming, that will be the jump that will shift things entirely. But we've never seen consoles not improve as much until current times. The games medium is young enough to where every 5 to 10 years, back in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, things were radically changing. The introduction of 8-bit to 16-bit to 3D graphics to standard definition to high definition to 4K. What's next? I don't
Yeah.
know. 120 FPS versus 60 FPS, I guess. And I think that there will be a change in how games are designed. This is future projection in a way that's like not really possible to nail down specifically because it's never happened before. But I do agree with him on the larger scale that game design will inevitably have to be more focused on differentiation in terms of mechanics rather than just trying to get a game that looks really, really goddamn pretty, which will still exist, of course. But I think he's right in that it has to kind of eventually not be the focus as technology begins to plateau.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm just not sure if we have much evidence of this being the case.
Sure,
And and
of
I
course, of
and I
course.
think this is part of where a lot of people's frustration comes in of saying we're always chasing pretty, right?
Yeah,
And I think it became super clear with PS5 and Series X of like that appeal is not it's not as strong anymore, right?
exactly,
Because
exactly.
we can start HDRing and ray tracing and 4King our games if we want, but those diminishing returns are going to start to become more obvious.
Yeah,
Um, but it seems that that's not really changing, right? What's
yeah.
interesting about Tears of the Kingdom and why I think for all my sort of complicated feelings on the game that I'm still working on as I play, it's very cool to see Nintendo release a game that everybody, I'm talking about not only players, but game developers are rallying around as a sort of a marvel of code and engineering.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a game like that that I think is quite heartening in that
Yeah.
it illustrates that you really can woo an audience not only
Mm.
intellectually but financially because the game is doing so well
Yes, it is.
on the basis of appeals that aren't technological, right?
Yeah.
And we think about like the ways in which Sony is criticized sometimes for always just chasing that fidelity and
Hmm.
that cinematic quality. Nintendo has been able to time and time again, but right now in this moment, Tears of the Kingdom prove that you can sort of captivate everyone's attention by doing the opposite. Now,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
also a great degree of style and art direction and careful thought that goes into Tears of the Kingdom. It's not an ugly game by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly not. It's not even pushing resolution or frame rate at
No.
all.
No.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think to to really extract more of the medium, this is the direction we need to move in
Yeah. Exactly.
because the sort of emergent gameplay possibilities in something like Tears of the Kingdom, I think is truly modern and interesting and
Absolutely.
complex.
And that's what Aonuma was talking
Yeah,
about when he said he was so pleased with the way that people are really appreciating Tears of the Kingdom. It is selling very well. It's obviously critically acclaimed to the moon and back, if
yeah,
not like the greatest of all time critically acclaimed. Um, is that he thinks that the gameplay structure that they established with something like Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time and then iterated on in the sequels for the GameCube, Wii, and Wii U largely, is that there's a difference in there being one solution to a puzzle versus you discovering through your understanding of game mechanics your own solution to the
yeah.
puzzle, and he really appreciates that, and he said that that's what the future of Zelda is going to be, and of course that's going to ruffle some fans of the older styles feathers. But I do think in terms of what you were saying, people marveling at the code of this feel like a step forward in terms of how a game can be designed around the mindset of modern game players who have hundreds of different games of experience under their belt and a variety of different understanding of puzzles and mechanics and physics in games that just didn't exist back in the day for the earlier Zelda titles. I agree that with the success of something like Tears of the Kingdom, we could see other developers want to take that choose your own approach to game design. And I think that is what's really exciting me about while I'm playing Tears of the Kingdom. I'm not exactly the most emergent game player. I was actually kind of having a discussion with our friend Bro on the server about this. I kind of look for the intended solution because I like
Sure.
to sort of search out what the developer has as like the baseline puzzle solving. And sometimes I say, I don't fucking get this, and then I put a rocket on my shield and build a weird bridge and get on the thing. But the idea is I can make that choice. And I think that for me is what makes Tears of the Kingdom and other games like it, though I guess this is kind of really one of the only true examples of
Yeah.
it, feel so fresh in an industry and even in a franchise that had until Breath of the Wild kind of stagnated. Even a lot of Nintendo's IPs, as I think we'll talk about here, them being the ones that are holding out against graphical innovation and instead going for different styles of gameplay. And their games don't look the best, but they do sell the best comparatively to most other companies. Tears of the Kingdom is kind of the apex of
Yeah.
that, and it's why I'm enjoying it so much. And I really hope, who the hell knows if this actually didn't happen, but that people recognize, the other developers recognize that they can spend the time on figuring out a different style of gameplay rather than game look, which I think would be really exciting. But it's also fucking hard. I mean, this is
Right.
probably one of the hardest games that has ever been developed. And so I don't expect the majority of games companies to take that element from Tears of the Kingdom because how? How would they?
Yeah, I mean, Tears of the Kingdom is interesting in that it's developed under such specific conditions,
Hmm.
some of which simply can't be replicated, some of which ideally can be. Like, Tears of the Kingdom is developed by people who've been working on Zelda for their entire careers, right?
Yeah.
And I think Ayanuma was even saying something about, like, he might have ideas for other games, but he'd rather funnel them back into Legend of Zelda and grow that franchise.
Yeah.
There's a sort of solidarity and creative solidarity and amongst the team that doesn't really exist elsewhere culturally, structurally. I mean, a lot of Western studios are going to change, franchises are going to change hands between them, or teams are going to come and go, or like you look at how Microsoft uses a lot of contract work. Um,
Yeah. Mm.
for games like Halo, whereas when Nintendo needs help, they are always going to Monolith. So
Yeah.
if there's a
Yeah.
support studio, it's always very clearly defined, right? There's some just sort of structural stuff that has been reinforced over decades that might not be replicable. But I think what's brilliant about Tears of the Kingdom, sort of a macro level, is that it is yet another example of the fact that big imaginative single player games are still the future of the industry. And
Yeah.
and
Mm.
a part
Yeah.
of conversation that I always find frustrating that seems to be lingering even in the face of so much counter evidence is this idea that, oh, big innovative single player games or even big iterative single player games are kind of disappearing.
Yeah.
That's simply not the case.
Of course. Yeah.
Um,
Elden Ring sold a bazillion fucking copies last year.
and not only that, but the other example I like to point to that I think undercuts a lot of the rhetorical doom and gloom around the future of the games
Hmm.
industry is EA.
Sure.
EA is a very, very good publisher now, and I think not enough people give them credit for what they've become.
Yeah.
When you look at EA, you gotta think about games like Jedi Fallen Order, Jedi Survivor, Need for
Yeah.
Speed. What's the new one called? Burnout, I think.
Unbound.
Unbound. Thank you. It's
Yeah.
Unbound.
Burnout is actually another racing franchise.
Thank you. Yeah.
It'd be really interesting if it was Need for Speed Burnout. That would be like, what are you doing here?
Dead Space remake, right?
Yeah.
Star Wars Squadrons. I mean, you can go
It
back,
Takes Two. No, it's not single player though, so never mind. Roll it
but
back, but kind
even
of.
still, point being, then as you're saying that they have this whole EA Originals program, which has birthed things like that and Unravel and the new Immortals of Avium game and various things. It feels like a lot of the criticism levied against the future of the games industry is sort of stuck in the past and stuck
Sure. Mm.
in a space of conversation is no longer indicative of where even the biggest players in the medium are. Even as
Yeah.
we're facing down these issues of huge dev cycles and nickel and diming monetization strategies and things that we'll talk about later in this video, you look at somebody like EA, who used to be considered like the boogeyman of all of this stuff, like the worst of the worst offender, and for all these points, they're really not. I mean, even
Yeah.
if they put out a game like Battlefield 2042, which doesn't turn out very well, You can point to a good half dozen or more single player co-op titles
Yeah,
that are really exceptional. You can even
absolutely.
point to the space they gave DICE to fix Star Wars Battlefront 2. You can point to the continued support of Apex Legends.
Yeah.
A lot of the big evil players in the game space aren't who we think they are, and they're contributing to these trends that are very, very positive of uplifting super
Yeah.
successful big single player experiences and pushing the envelope in various ways. We're not going to this funnel of like nickel and dime, always online, multiplayer only, battle pass horse shit that it
Hmm.
feels like a lot of people think we are. That's just, I don't
Yeah.
think that's indicative of how the industry is actually progressing.
No, it's definitely true. I think people let the examples of negative elements of these trends, because they absolutely still exist. Even EA, of course, we're praising an element of them, but they
Yeah,
still have games that are
of
contributing to
course.
these things that we will, even that you and I, who are, as we're talking about here, more positive about the direction of the games industry, there are elements of what they're doing
Yeah,
that are the worst of the worst still to this day. But I think that people let those negative elements overshadow the when you break it down in terms of title by title basis, where the negative doesn't necessarily overshadow the amount of games, even not just from EA, but from all the other companies that aren't what people think they are. And the main example that I will point to, and I don't have the numbers on this, but I think you could get the numbers on
sure.
it, is the idea of bad game launches, which I think is in the last 2 to 3 years the biggest point of, oh my god, doom and gloom, the games industry is going downhill. And I'm going to read from a comment from our friend Franz here, who says the fact that this year it's basically been a roulette to see if a game will actually be competent at launch, despite constant delays, shows the over reliance of deadlines rather than actual products that meet customer standards, and that's just depressing. And that goes with then that goes with wait. And that goes with making waiting for public opinion slash games being fixed an OP gamer move. I think with
Sure.
a classic Franz phrase there. But I think that the idea of bad launches being the sort of dominant discussion force in terms of the direction of the games industry is certainly a valid one, as more games continue to come out that do have these problems with them. Last year with Gotham Knights and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet launching within a few weeks of each other. Some examples this year: Last of Us Part 1 port on PC, Star Wars Jedi Survivor having issues. There are a lot of games that have these problems, but again, I don't have the specific numbers on this, but I do think that if you break it down on a title by title basis, these are still the minority. And I think people allow those big games that have problematic launches to outweigh the fact that most games don't launch with these issues. It's just the ones that catch our attention and end up overtaking the discussion sphere that makes it feel like every game has this problem and every publisher has a game with this problem and multiple and down the line. Like, man,
Right.
it's so rare when we get a game that launches like Tears of the Kingdom. But that's not true. If you think about Nintendo last year, they published like 12 games, and one of them had that issue. I mean, even Pokemon Legends Arceus didn't have the kind of issues that Scarlet and Violet had. So on a Pokemon by Pokemon basis, it's not even the majority. It's half of the games that came out last year. But people let this negative cloud of bad launches, kind of spurred on by Cyberpunk back in 2020, take over the conversation in a way that I don't think is necessarily warranted, because there are so many games that launch without these issues.
Yeah, it's tricky. I don't I don't know necessarily if you're right or not.
Sure, sure.
I think the thing about it is the overarching point Franz makes, I think, is a salient one, in that this is where it kind of comes back to this distinction I was making before between the creative outlook of the medium and sort of the realities of the industry.
Yeah,
Like when you're talking about games that are making such a significant amount of money, and when it takes so much longer to develop a game, you need to get it out. You need to get that
yeah,
money back. You need to hit these deadlines. And that does lead to, maybe it's not, if you look at pound for pound all the games that release, the majority that release broken. But I think you can make a good argument, as Franz was making, for a significant portion of the games people are really, really anticipating
sure.
not
That's a good
hitting the
point.
way
Yeah,
they should.
yeah,
And this goes back to some of these underlying realities of the industry. And this is
Mhm.
where some of my point from before about these challenges comes in. When you are making a game that has to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and the budget is higher and higher and higher and higher, the expectations become super, super huge to just make your money back
Yeah.
and to appease investors. And you can't be missing too many deadlines. That just can't be happening because of the importance put on these games. So it feels like to me something needs to change on almost a level of expectation
Yeah.
where
Mm.
where we need to condition people to be more okay with less, but not less in the
Sure.
worst
Yes.
way.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's okay for a game to be smaller, a little bit more focused, and have a intention and nail that, or just to be more receptive to delays and various things.
Yeah.
It's tricky because at a certain point, you probably can't delay your game anymore. At a
Yeah.
certain
Yeah.
point, CD Projekt Red needed the money. They
Mhm.
had investors. They needed the Cyberpunk money.
Mhm.
Can't be delayed anymore. Here's Cyberpunk, right?
Yeah.
Very few people are in a position like Nintendo where they can say, as Aonuma has admitted, the game was largely done in 2022. But he said, yeah, I want another year to make sure it's as good as it can be.
Yeah.
Very few people are in that position. So I think we need to recognize that. And and it's one of those things where I don't even know if there's any solution necessarily. You
Yeah.
know?
Well, what's interesting is about conditioning people. I think that's absolutely the direction that
Yeah.
we, as content creators, as people in this discussion sphere, where we can make our impact, is trying to convince the people that are the most worried about this to to be like you're saying, allow them the sort of mental space to accept when games aren't
Right.
bigger and more visually attractive and more content and more points of interest and more players on the battlefield in 2042. uh that it's okay if those aren't met because there might be
Yeah.
quality in other areas. And I do think that a good trend that we're seeing is, while the biggest games, the ones that are having these problems, and it's not every biggest game, but a lot of, as you said, a significant chunk of the biggest games are having these issues, the games that get the most praise in this industry are the ones that don't have those issues. Of course, they might not be the ones that are getting the most sales. A yearly Call of Duty or a yearly Pokemon or games in other gigantic franchises are still selling very, very well, but on a level of critical acclaim and passion, those games don't get the passion that the ones that don't have these issues are. You think about this year with the launch of something like Hi-Fi Rush, that is the biggest success that Xbox has had in a long time. And that game is small. It's much the smallest project that team has ever made. It
Right.
was a pretty big deal for Game Pass. It's again one of their most critically acclaimed games of the last, man, 12, 15, 20 years. And I think that on the publisher side, when they see the critical acclaim that some of these games are taking, maybe they will see those and be like, we can learn from that. We can learn from the success of Tears of the Kingdom that was ready a year ago, but then spent a year in the polishing stage. We can take from Hi-Fi Rush or other smaller examples from games like Pentiment last year that are smaller than anything those teams have done, but they are receiving higher critical acclaim and significantly more passion and discussion on that level than Battlefield 2042 did, which came out and was promptly fucking forgotten. It was destroyed first and then promptly fucking
Right.
forgotten about. Which is what happens to a lot of these games that launch in broken, unfinished, ridiculous states. They get a week in the sun and then everyone leaves, even if they sell well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point of like publishers are not dumb, right?
Yeah.
They see what
Well,
happens to these other games and they try to avoid it.
mm-hmm.
And so it is an interesting situation. And like I'm sure that when Fallen Order was delayed, for instance,
Yeah.
the respawn went to EA and EA thought about the whole situation. I'm sure they were told like, look, we can release the game now and it's probably going to do okay, but we're going to have this really bad narrative around the game and we need to avoid that.
Yeah.
I think that there's probably an understanding of avoidance there, and I do think that there might be more of a culture of acceptance around delays
Mm-hmm.
from all sides, right? I think
I think that's truer now than it ever has been.
Yeah.
Even with the text blocks of doom that have been collecting like infinity stones over the last couple of years.
I find people's I think the whole anger around the text post things to be an example of how the game's discourse is so far behind where it should be.
Sure,
Because I really do feel like clowning on those posts makes you look like a fool.
sure, yeah,
Um, because as somebody was saying on Twitter, the contents of half of those posts are not "Hey, we're delaying the game." Half it's like, "Please don't harass the developers,"
sure.
which people are
And then you
annoying.
clown on the post, and then so you're indirectly clowning on the developers for wanting to share that message.
The
Yeah,
other one is like, guys, what would you prefer? Would the preferential thing be they don't talk to you?
yeah, yeah,
There's this sentiment, and I think this sentiment is part of what feeds into the overarching issue of the industry. There's like the sentiment that games are products, and this is one of the things I really don't like.
yeah.
Obviously, commercial art and entertainment is product. We can't ignore that. But I don't like this sort of framing of we are consumers and we deserve this and we deserve that and yet da da da
Sure,
da.
yeah,
Because games are still an art form, ultimately, in my opinion. They are art. And even if it's commercialized, there needs to be a little bit more understanding of the people involved. And
absolutely,
and there needs to
absolutely.
be less hemming and hawing about scale and well, if I'm giving you my $70, you're giving me a product and it needs to hit these bullet points.
Yeah,
I think that's wrong. And I think the ways we talk about developers are wrong. I think a
yeah,
lot of it's wrong. And that's part of what I want to impart here, that you're talking about games like it's still 2016
yeah.
and it's Gamergate. It's not. And I
Mhm.
think it's very foolish to ascribe these issues and refer to developers in this way and think that these things are happening in this space when they just aren't.
Yeah, and I really actually do appreciate those text blocks of doom that
I
have
do
become
too.
so notorious because I think that people the view of it being products and developers are just corporations and we deserve these products with these metrics yada yada, those are holdovers, as you said, from a bygone era when there wasn't that kind of communication. We are currently getting that kind of
Right.
communication, and I don't think I just don't think it's been around long enough for people to sort of shift and understand. Will people ever shift and understand? I'm not sure if that's a thing that we can ever solidly say. But on a personal level, I agree with you in that over the last couple of years, I have become a lot more cognizant of even the worst games and games I don't like and the games that have these issues and that are obviously pushed by corporations like CD Projekt to push CD Projekt Red to put out a game like Cyberpunk at the state that came out in. The idea that there still are people behind this whose fault that it's a mess is that's not their it's not the designer's problem. It's not the artist's problem necessarily that these games are in the state that they're in. There's of course some examples where that's the case,
Yeah.
but I have found it very personally gratifying to listen in to the people involved in making these games and getting them to us and knowing them as people and connecting them on a human level. It's like they're still people talking to other people making decisions that they don't want to fuck people over and they want to make the best thing that they can, but economic realities and corporate infighting and all this nonsense ends up pushing things out when they're not ready, and it's the fault of larger conflict between economic forces and not necessarily the people involved, which is why I was so personally pleased with Phil Spencer being incredibly candid on the XCast a couple weeks ago because it made me understand him more as a person involved in a ridiculous scale of dozens of fucking companies
Right.
and games and holy shit, but he's still a guy at the top, and him seeing him not in the best mood and kind of defeated a little bit, even though it was maybe not the greatest look for a confident corporation that's going to be competing with Sony and Nintendo, I gained an appreciation for Xbox as a brand and Phil Spencer as a guy who's trying his hardest, and it's maybe not working out. But I don't want to insult Phil in that he is the guy. He's just a guy at the top. He's not a robot force. He's
Right.
trying to make these things work, and I apply that down and down to all the developer interviews that I've read and listening to the conversations with people that whose names I didn't know before. Even like learning about the directors of certain Nintendo games whose names I had never heard before. That allows me to realize it's not Nintendo making these games. It's not Microsoft publishing these games. It's the developers of specific Nintendo game or the directors of specific Nintendo games and Phil Spencer up at the top. These are still people at the end of the day. And I think that's a sentiment that I carry that still gives me hope for even the worst aspects of this. Because I don't
Yeah.
think the people, the artists involved, want to deliver us these piss poor products.
Yeah, it's tricky because, like, in the case of that Phil Spencer interview, I it made me less confident as an Xbox owner because I felt like the things he was saying communicated that there's a real weakness within that ecosystem.
Yeah, sure.
But at the same time, the fact that Phil Spencer was even able to get out there and say those things in its own light is important and interesting. I feel like,
Yeah.
again, how I was splitting the atom between like the medium and the industry. I think we need to also look at the difference between like the mess, like the rhetorical like weight of the message, the fact the message is being shared. The fact that
Mm.
Phil Spencer's out there and communicating is very, 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 very good.
Yeah.
If I was on the Xbox team, I might have told Phil, go out and do that interview, but don't say this or don't phrase
Sure.
it in that even if we make an 11 out of 10 game, it's not going to help our ecosystem. Like I would have told him to have those messages come across differently, but I still would
Sure.
have had him go out there and say that. And
Yeah.
this is sort of what I'm trying to communicate about these text post messages. Yes, guys, I get it. It's really funny that you can sub out the name of the studio and the name of the game and the message reads the same. I get it. But it's important that they're saying that. And it's important that
Yeah.
we open these lines of communication and that we take value in that and we start to strip away a lot of these sort of false conceptions around how games are made and around the industry and everything. And that's important. It's important
Yeah.
that we listen to people actually making our games.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Is there another comment we want to sort of redirect this flow towards?
yeah, I want to talk with someone with that our friend Daniel Navaroli, the Nordic Gods fame, leaves.
Of God, we should be so lucky to get Daniel Navaroli of Nerdy Gods fame commenting.
The short answer to are we worried is yes. Monetization in gaming is getting completely out of hand with mobile gaming, free-to-play, microtransactions, pre-order bonuses, multiple expensive editions, battle passes, and season passes. The industry is poisoned with nickel and diamond consumers for every single piece of content that is just used to come with games. Something needs to change quickly. You want me to take this one first, or you got a thought right
Yeah,
off
yeah.
the bat?
Because you were talking about this earlier, so I just
Yeah.
want to hear your I guess rebuttal to this, or maybe not.
I get the point that that Daniel's making here. Because this is something that Colin Moriarty and David Jaffe are actually talking about recently on the podcast they did together. Of like,
Yeah.
where did monetization start to change?
Yeah.
And
Horse
they
armor.
say it's with the App Store. And that's a great point
Yeah.
because mobile gaming, to Daniel's point here, did introduce all of these sort of new strategies for monetizing games and free to play and all of these things that you could argue are bad for the space. You could say are not bad. I think the truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I agree.
But I think, again, to the point about sort of where the discourse is versus where the games are, I think we've moved past this point of awful monetization strategy.
Yeah.
I just don't think that's indicative of where we are anymore. Because to bring it back to EA for a second, you think about Star Wars Battlefront 2, which is the one where microtransactions really came to a head, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
With the launch of that game, the star card system and everything, EA got fucked when they tried to do that.
Yeah. And they stopped it.
And they stopped it. They completely stopped it. And I think that really was an inflection point. And what's been replaced with this, I feel like the moment of microtransactions is gone.
Mm-hmm.
They're still in a lot of games, but they're not nearly as pervasive as they used to be.
Yeah.
And you're looking at like a battle pass system now. And you're looking at somebody like 343 come out with Halo and say, hey, look, we're doing a battle pass, but we're going to do it in a very ethical way. You can earn, they're not limited time. They go forever. This system, This is the main vehicle for progression. You buy the battle, you get the game for free. You buy the battle pass, $10 a season. You progress, you're good. You can buy that um, currency to get the cosmetics if you want them, these cosmetics if you want them, but you don't have to.
Yeah.
And so this goes back again to another one of the core realities of game development. Of people are people are wanting to spend less and less for their games. People are getting conditioned.
Free is pretty low.
Yeah, people are conditioned to get things for free. They don't want to pay $70. Apparently $70 is the line in the sand for people.
Yeah.
At the same time, budgets are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. God of War Ragnarok cost $200 million to make. It's delusional to think that developers will not find new ways to monetize you if you're not willing to pay a higher
The upfront cost. Yeah.
upfront cost.
Yeah.
Nintendo coming out and saying, "Look, Tears of the Kingdom is bigger than we thought it was going to be. You got to pay $70 for it." Sorry,
Yeah.
everybody did because the product was strong, right? But not everybody is Nintendo. Not everybody has that fan base built in and the strength of those IP. So they have to do things like this. They have to say, "Well, if we're making a shooter, you're not going to buy it at full price, so we got to make it free to play, so you get you in the door. But then we have to make money off of you, so we're going to try these things."
Yeah.
I think there's been enough trial and error on the monetization front that even where there is microtransactions or there are battle passes, the big players largely know how to do it in a way that is equitable and is not going to upset people. We're going to have to either get used to paying more for our games or get used to paying these incremental fees for things in our games.
Yeah, I really do agree with that. And I think that when you look at the scale of games that have some option of microtransactions in them, it is a lot of the biggest games currently. But I do think on a gameplay standpoint, on a structure standpoint, on a quality standpoint, a lot of the games that have stuck around, that have these models to them, aren't the ones that are the problem.
No.
When you think about Fortnite or Apex Legends or Call of Duty Warzone, these games are incredibly high quality games. High fidelity, tight gameplay, not a lot of bugs. These are the kind of games that if they were $70 and just they were just sold for that and there wasn't these microtransactions, people would be like, oh my god, I can't believe what a quality game this is. This is not launching with all these issues. But the problem then comes that these are games that are primarily the free to play multiplayer focused games that are what Daniel's sort of taking issue with here. These are games that need a long-term player base to remain alive and give those developers a job and have the corporation and the investors that are funding them the confidence to say this is not something that's going to disappear, like frankly many have. And I think when you watch the difference between the games that succeed in the space and the ones that don't, games like Rocket Arena and Destruction All Stars and Lawbreakers and oh god, what was the Overwatch clone
Battleborn.
Battleborn, thank you, Battleborn. These are games that come out that try to ape on Overwatch or Warzone or Apex or PUBG or whatever, and don't stick around because they aren't as good of games. And so the market kind of has, I think, settled in a place that even though I don't play a lot of these games, I'm pretty comfortable with because there is thousands, if not infinite, hours of gameplay in Fortnite. And that's proven by a lot of people who play Fortnite. And I'm not a Fortnite player. I'm not a Warzone player. I'm not an Apex player. The games that have these elements in them, they are ultimately optional elements. You can still play an incredibly high quality, visually impressive, cross-platform game in Fortnite for thousands of hours without paying $1 if you want to. And it's not pay to win, it's skins. It's like, oh, I want to look like Spider-Man 2099 or Hatsune Miku or whatever in my game. That's a choice that a player is making. And I think the devs finding this place where optional content can be added to games and supported in games that are where they can get their money because a lot of people do want these things while there being an incredibly high quality game there for free if you want to, I think is a pretty healthy place to be. And the success of something like Fortnite that is free to play and has been for its entire life cycle or the majority of its life cycle, I guess since the Battle Royale mode was released, I think proves that there is something healthy to this, is that Fortnite players, who frankly, that's all that Fortnite matters to. If you don't play Fortnite, you're not the target audience. If Fortnite players are happy and Epic is happy, I mean, I think that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I look at something like Fortnite, and I do take issue with the fact that you have to spend like $20 to get a Goku skin. I do find that to be
Sure. I mean,
somewhat
I don't
ridiculous.
know the exact. I don't know the exact number, so I'm not.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a little ridiculous.
but the point being is that it is largely cosmetic, and
Yeah.
you make a good point of like you have to sacrifice somewhere. If you're gonna play Fortnite every day for years and years and years, well, they have to make money off of you at some turn, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
People want these games to
yeah,
be free and big and beautiful and not have to pay money anywhere. That doesn't quite match economic reality of how these things are supported, especially a game like Fortnite that not only has these skins that I'm sure are overpriced. I actually did not know that like a Goku skin was like $20, but there are also games that are updated constantly with like gigantic changes and all sorts of new, like people have to develop these changes, so you got to pay them at some point for them to continue making this.
yeah, and if we're talking more about like maybe at cost games that have microtransactions, I would just I'd probably push back on the idea that that's even as prominent as it used to be.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
you look at something like Halo Infinite, right? They made a decision to say, okay, we're gonna make that free to play, and we'll monetize it in certain ways,
yeah.
right? I think, and there are bad examples of games like having paid currencies introduced after launch. That's happened in a couple
Mm,
cases, like Assassin's
sure.
Creed, or I believe Crash Team Racing actually had that happen. So there is still things like that that happen that are pernicious and that are not good. But I think on the whole, the fact that you can now sort of scale your monetization strategy is good and is a positive change for the industry of saying,
Yeah,
hey, look, we can release our game at full price, and you can make like a flowchart of how your game should be monetized. Paid, free to play, boom,
yeah.
splits off in all kinds of different decisions you can make. Free to play, microtransactions, battle pass, choose,
Hmm.
right? And you can kind of spider web. And the fact that we're moving beyond, okay, dropping things, the fact that you're moving beyond every game must cost this much money, and then you're going to start piling on these more pernicious strategies. The fact that we're beyond that's very good.
Yeah,
Everything's sort of settled out a little bit. It's not the era of Battlefront 2 anymore. It's the era of the monetization strategy, for the most part, matching the game.
sure.
And,
Yeah,
and that's and unfortunately that's just how it's gonna have to be. Games are gonna keep costing this much to make, they need to make more money off of you.
yeah, yeah. Let's jump over to another comment in sort of a different area, one that comes from our friend Sith Scott in the Discord server. Again, if you're not in this Discord server and you listen to all these great comments, be one of them. Contribute. Don't be a lazy ass, fucker. Okay. Scott says, this is a difficult thing to talk about personally. On one hand, yes, the future of a lot of AAA gaming seems to be going into live service and battle pass oriented video games. I really hate this as it makes the game constantly force a feeling of FOMO. Interesting. It shouldn't be, but they don't want to add all the content at all times due to either game space or due to a forced scarce limitation. Does that translate everywhere? No. I'm heavy into indie games and they are constantly getting improved over and over. A lot of small game companies are still churning out games with a passion that may not be as big in presentation, but absolutely makes you love how the game plays or the themes it runs with. So actually, this is building very nicely off of what we were just talking about in terms of
Right.
his negative view on the industry, or his pessimistic side being more focused on battle pass and free to play and microtransactions, which I think we made a pretty good case for being in a at least healthier state than they have been in the last decade. The FOMO thing I find very interesting because I think that maybe this is just me being sort of a shill for capitalism, maybe, but the idea of there being limited products, especially, it makes less sense in a game where it's a fucking piece of code. They could give this skin to everyone if they wanted to. But in terms of a game developer who's had a game out for 5 years and they want to introduce something that people are going to get excited for, I think that introducing things that are either available for a limited time or have some sort of scarcity to them or FOMO element is really the only way that you can really pull in enough people to then fund your game further. Because if Goku skin, we're just there is a Goku skin, but we're just focusing on this for whatever the fuck reason. If Goku skin was released and it was just there, then Dragon Ball fans / Fortnite fans are gonna be like, I can get that at any point. But if you put the skin out and everyone wants to go get the skin, then they're gonna actually show up and play the game, which I think I don't even play these games, but I understand the psychology and the decision making that comes behind a publisher like Fortnite, no, a publisher like Epic making Fortnite and deciding these are things that are going to be events. They're going to bring the community together, and they're not going to be available forever, but it's going to continually re-up our game and boost it. I think it does make sense on a decision making level, even if there are elements to it that are kind of scummy. It's just kind of how products work in our modern day and age.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is a tricky one because you're right of like how else are you gonna do it? But there's like games like Destiny 2 is a great example for me of, to me it feels impossible to try to play Destiny 2 now.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that yesterday.
Because I'm just too far behind. It's
Yeah.
impossible for me to get in now. So I'm sure there's probably a cost benefit analysis that Bungie's done of like how many people are going to retain by constantly refreshing and sunsetting things and adding new events and raids and strikes and weapons and everything, and how many are we going to lose? How many people are going to want to jump in but won't? How do we get them in? There's a
Yeah.
whole new sort of strategy and dance to curating a player base and retaining it
Mm-hmm.
that people didn't really have to think about before. Um, and I don't necessarily know if that's for the better or worse. If I can, I'm actually just going to draw another comment now.
Sure. Perfect.
Because I want to draw in. Here it is. Our friend Bro left about preservation.
This is the comment I'm most interested in.
Yeah. So in the preservation games falls on dedicated players, these alternative retro options are actively worse than previous iterations, and new games that are released are also not released with longevity in mind. Some games do indeed die when the company thinks they're not profitable enough to support, or at least gut their online systems. The reason why I'm addressing the conversation is because when you look at a game like Destiny, even if it might keep me out, I mean, I played Destiny 1 religiously because in high school I had less games to play, obviously, so I'm just like in it, right? I see people say the idea that like Kojima's making a cloud game with Xbox is bad
Yeah.
because the game's going to go away. Or like,
Mm-hmm.
as Sis Scott's saying, there's a sense of FOMO in a game like Destiny. I'm going to miss out on something.
Yeah.
When it comes to preservation, I think there's this idea that all games must be preserved, and this is very thin ice I'm walking on here. But
Sure. Yeah.
not all traditional art is preserved.
Hmm.
Some art, some installation art, was made for a time and place, and now it's
Yeah.
gone. And it
That's a good
exists
point.
in the stories that it left behind, and exists in photographs and things.
Mm.
The medium of games in this online industry is thus that you can make a game that exists for a time and place,
Yeah.
and I think that's okay.
Sure.
I don't think there's a problem with that. I think stretching our legs and seeing what can we do that integrates time as a component of game design is very cool, actually.
Interesting. Yeah, never thought about it that way.
It's cool that you just had to be there, you know? There's something to that.
You had to be at the Fortnite event that Galactus came up and fucking ate the planet, and
Yeah.
Ariana Grande hopped out of his fucking mouth or what. I don't know. I wasn't there.
Yeah. I just think that the FOMO point is salient in that there are times that I felt like I'm too far behind to get in. But
Yeah.
I also think there's something special about leveraging time. And
Yeah.
there's something true about the fact that not every piece of art in every artistic medium is preserved, because some of it was meant to exist for a specific duration of time. And I
Sure.
think that's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that, because I've honestly never thought about it in that way, but I think you make a very interesting point in comparing games to other mediums in that not everything lasts forever, and there probably are people that worry about that, or that think that is a negative element of it. But ultimately, it's up to those artists. I think the difference is, even though I do think that is a salient point and maybe something that I would like to consider a little bit more heavily,
Yeah.
is that a lot of these games aren't designed or decided by that artistic merit of it being only a time and place thing. That
Right.
there are some. There was a game called Curiosity: What's Inside the Cube, which was a mobile game that was designed for cooperative play across the entire planet. It's a game that it was involved in. It was mining this gigantic block. It was a social. It was a sort of social study about people working together. What kind of processes or like sharing things together are they going to decide? And at the end of that game, because there was a definitive end, was mining in this giant cube. There's one cube in the middle, and one person will win this game, but will everyone work together to get to the point where only one person can win? And that is an example of a game that existed specifically in one iteration for a social study in game design that is now gone. You can never re-access it, but it was designed for that purpose. But when you think about a game like, let's just say Foam Stars, a game that's not out yet. Foam Stars, if we future project a little bit, and I think safely so, following the track of many recent games, Knockout City, Rumble Fest, Rumble Crashes. You fucking stitch any of these words together, and you can come up with a free to play multiplayer oriented game that has since gone by the wayside. These games were not designed with the thought in mind. They were not created by these developers to be like, this is gonna be a cool 6-month thing.
Right.
We're gonna do it. It's gonna be awesome. People are gonna have fun, but it's a time and place. These games were designed, like the list I mentioned earlier, to exist in perpetuity, and then financially they were not able to maintain that. And now, not only do the developers not have a job, does that franchise not exist anymore, but even the bare bones gameplay of this game that was not designed to disappear, not necessarily to disappear, at least in that quick of time, is just completely inaccessible. And I think for me, that is where Bro's comment about games are not released with longevity in mind is my, I think, biggest problem with the modern games industry. Games like, even on our Lord and Savior Nintendo side,
Right.
Mario Bros. 35 is a game that was unique. It had an interesting spin on the Mario formula and was celebrating a moment. But it was celebrating a moment, but it didn't seem like it needed to only celebrate that moment for a certain period of time, because it was an interesting gameplay idea in and of itself. And now I have the app on my Switch home screen. Well, that's the closest I'm ever going to get to seeing or experiencing that game again, unless they make Super Mario Bros. 36. Oh, no, that would have already happened. If they make Super Mario Bros. 40, how many years is it? 2020, so I guess. But games like this are just gone to history, and it leaves, I think, an interesting hole where if the games industry was more on your side, in that some developers were creating in the moment experiences and they were just disappearing because that was the intended design, and some were making some that were designed to exist in perpetuity and did not because they were supported but because they were preserved for experience, means that there's a hole in games history, or there will be, where the 2017 to 2020 blank pool of multiplayer online games, a substantial amount of them are not accessible and will never be played again. And that means that genre, that period of time, cannot be fully researched or built upon for future understanding, because 70%, that's just a fucking guess, or a good amount of them are just were deleted.
Yeah,
they're gone, including Mario Bros. 35 and Pac-Man 99.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Mario 35 is interesting because that's something they did say, that this is limited from the beginning, which is funny.
That goes a little bit against my initial point,
but your point on the whole, that's just a funny one. But your point is 100% correct, and it does make you think a little bit of like the era of film, because there's what's this percentage of silent film that's around?
Ununderstandably large number of silent films that were just rewritten, or the film decayed and they're lost to time, including a few Best Picture nominees, which I think is very interesting. So if we're doing our Best Picture quest, because of the lack of preservation
Yeah.
in that time, we will never be able to fully experience the lineup of Best Picture nominees because I think like four of them, three or four of them, don't exist. They do
Yeah.
not exist. And if there was Game of the Year and it was Rumble Fest and Knockout City and Foam Stars and Lawbreakers, well,
Was
what are we gonna
was
do?
Overwatch Game of the Year in 2016?
It was, and Overwatch is gone.
Yeah.
Overwatch, as it was when it won Game of the Year, is not a game that you can access anymore. Though I think eventually they'll release an Overwatch Classic. I think Blizzard is big enough
They will.
there where it'll be printed on a fucking disc. It'll be Overwatch Classic, and it'll be a fucking thing. But most games don't have that behind them. Of course, that's a very different example.
Yeah, but it is tricky. I don't really know what the answer is for this because
Yeah, no, absolutely.
you're right that kind of the point I'm making relies more heavily on the idea of intent.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you're saying, the intent is actually perpetuity. The intent is not the
Or
inevitable
at least as
shutdown.
close to perpetuity as you can get. Something
Right.
like Fortnite will exist for. Oh, I don't know if Fortnite will exist forever, but if
Yeah.
Fortnite disappears, that's even if it's in 70 years, that's a fucking huge deal.
Yeah, and that's interesting because it's sort of it's an interesting thing because how could you possibly preserve it?
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. Which version do you choose? With which updates? The person playing it, does their inventory have all the skins? Is that part of the experience of the game? What? Where's the servers? How do people play together? We don't have the infrastructure to make these kind of games exist forever. But I think that's something that,
Yeah.
whether it's people working on preservations or the corporations themselves putting out these games, need to work on at some point. But do they really? I don't know. It's very peculiar. But
Yeah.
still, as I said, this is my biggest issue with modern gaming.
Sure.
We stressed for weeks about the Wii U and 3DS eShops going down because there's a number of games that are inaccessible now, and they're not fucking Rumble Fight fucking online games. These are indie games that someone was like, "Oh, it'd be cool to put on a 3DS
These are
indie game."
Nintendo games.
Yeah, yeah. But that's sort of a different side of the same
Right.
conversation that
Yeah.
is my current biggest, because as someone who's very invested in games history, I think back to a game like Nobi Nobi Boy from Keita Takahashi, maybe my favorite game developer of all time.
Hmm.
I could partially experience that game if I bought someone's PS3 that had that game installed on it from back when it came out. But otherwise, I will never be able to experience Keita Takahashi's full thing. But that was intended as something that ended. So I'm able to like wrestle with that in my mind. I'm like, okay, it's Kata's fault, but like I respect him. But I don't know. I'll never be able to play fucking Rumble Fight, which is not a real game, but my fight still stands.
PT is the other big one, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's hard. Well, PT is interesting because like that was just Konami being a dickhead.
yeah.
Because PT is
That
this.
game could exist.
That's the thing. Could Battleborn really exist? Probably not. Because like, does Gearbox have the money to maintain those servers? I doubt it. If you don't maintain the servers, there's
Why don't
no.
you just put them on Randy Pitchford's personal servers where he keeps his other stuff?
Um, but there are these guys that I really like that I read about in Lock On Volume 5 called the Pretendo Network. You might have seen them
Okay.
because John Cartwright, I believe, made a video about it.
No, I didn't watch that one.
They're basically
Sorry, John, friend of the show.
friend of the show. They're basically recreating the Nintendo Network. So you can reconnect your Wii U and 3DS to the Pretendo Network instead of the Nintendo Network. And they're even like rebuilding it so you can hold spot fests in Splatoon 1
Really?
and doing things like that, which is super cool. It does feed back into Bro's point, though, about like this work having to be done by the fans.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the preservation point's interesting to me because obviously what I care most about in the industry is sort of the history and legacy games and everything. And so losing them, I feel like I should be more sad about things being lost than I really am.
Yeah.
But it's like the trade-off for me is these experiences. We're getting these experiences that couldn't exist otherwise. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, if they were intended to be something that exists in perpetuity, they couldn't be designed the way that they are.
yeah.
So I think that's interesting. Yeah.
It's like It is a bummer when we lose these games, but I had such great memories with them. And Overwatch 1 to be the Overwatch one that we both loved, it had to be an only online 6v6 PvP shooter, right?
Yeah.
The Overwatch we love, it could
That
not,
was experiencing updates, and we were
yeah, it
able to
couldn't be
be in
anything
there on the
else.
ground floor when the Sombra ARG happened. That you can't preserve the Sombra ARG.
And it sort of goes into why, not to plug my own work, but why I like what I do at Lost and Cult, in that game preservation, in my opinion, is more than just software. It's
Yeah,
about stories. I think that storytelling is a great way to preserve games because this stuff can sometimes only exist in our memories.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
guess I just don't necessarily see that as a problem because I like what that's allowed for. And I'll be
Sure.
fascinated to see what a Kojima cloud game looks like. Like,
Hmm.
there's something super, super interesting about that. What does that even mean?
Yeah,
What does it mean when you give one of the most
it's
brilliant
gonna be like Resident Evil 7 cloud version.
what does it mean when you give one of the most brilliant people to ever design a video game a
Yeah,
set
it's
of
gonna make the cloud type
the
genre.
cloud type genre? Yeah, who knows? And
I have no fucking
and so
clue.
I guess I'm just not as worried about the fact that these things go away because what we got is so interesting.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. It's a very interesting balance. Very interesting balance.
Yeah.
We actually have a very similar comment from our friend Gravity here, who just sort of continuing this. I don't know. I frankly haven't read this comment yet, so I don't know if it's gonna like continue this conversation or if it's gonna be kind of a bookend to it. But Gravity says games have been getting better and better lately in many ways, but things are also concerning. One major thing for me is games that have been released half baked with content locked behind quote unquote DLC. This is especially prevalent with
Relevant.
Western games that announce DLC along the initial game announcement. If you're going to start charging $70 a pop, at least give us all the content before thinking about making DLC. Man, I'm really fucking this one up. Another big one is the quote unquote all digital future and making games that have no business needing an online connection. We've already seen games that have gone offline because their servers were down and no one could even play the single player game, or games that are multiplayer focused and go offline after a year, never to be accessed again. Those really, to me, are the only things that worry me about the future of the industry. Other than that, I'm optimistic for most aspects of gaming.
Yeah, I mean, the always online component there is one that interests me. What do you think about this idea?
Can you pinpoint any examples of that? Because I can't, off the top of my head, think of any examples of always online games where that's been a problem.
One of the recent big ones was Gran Turismo 7.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I didn't even know that was a
Yeah.
game with that element.
There's a couple others that I'd have to think about it.
Hmm. What's interesting about something about like Gran Turismo 7, I don't know how much the always online element is baked into that game's like base code, but it feels like something that Sony might want to or might make the change to preserve at a certain point is remove that
Hmm.
element of it when that game is sort of gasping its last, and they'd be like, look, the offline element is or the online element is being removed, but we're converting the stuff that can be played offline to be, because I think Gran Turismo is important enough to Sony to where they won't want to lose that, but also who knows if that's true? I have no fucking clue. Gran Turismo 7 might be lost to time.
Yeah, and this is where I take issue with it because back to what I was saying about Overwatch. Overwatch had to exist in this way, right?
Yeah.
Gran Turismo 7 doesn't.
No, no.
So I think that's actually quite nefarious to lock a single player experience to an online connection. And that is definitely one thing that I am very nervous about.
Hmm.
Again, it's another practice I don't think is as common anymore,
Yeah.
but it's one that I think definitely needs to be curtailed. It extends also to things like DRM, though, because like Hi-Fi Rush was talked about in this way earlier, of like the only versions of Hi-Fi Rush that or sorry, there is no DRM free version of Hi-Fi Rush.
Yeah.
So and there's no physical copy of the game either. So there will be a point in time where unless something changes, Hi-Fi Rush will cease to exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
so I think the games that are encumbered by these online checks or DRM services or whatever are in real jeopardy because that's not a game that has any business existing only for a certain period of time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And these are sort of symptoms of the era of trying to prevent piracy and various things, but even the de novo era is not as like prevalent as it used to be.
Hmm.
I think companies are wisening up to this being something they can't do. I mean, obviously the Xbox One always online was killed really, really
Jesus,
quick.
so quick. Yeah, yeah,
Um, but this is one thing that I definitely think needs to be addressed
yeah,
because
absolutely.
there is no creative justification for why these games have these stringent
Yeah, only
requirements.
the economic
Right.
justification.
And
Yeah,
that's not good enough for me. If it's not good enough for me, it doesn't count.
exactly, exactly. We got two more comments here. They kind of bring this to a positive close.
Yeah, we have three more actually, but they are all positive.
Oh
They're
shit!
all
Wait, what?
positive. We're good.
Oh, I didn't see the one down below from Andrew.
That's okay.
Wait, no. I think Andrew's is okay. You want to go from least positive to most positive?
Yeah.
Let's start with Andrew
Yeah,
here.
you read. You redeem yourself.
Under the title Monopolies and Economies, as provided by Avon Buhner. He gave each of these a little title, a little summary title. And our friend Andrew Roscoe of My Star Wars Show and Backcon Banter fame says, "I'm not worried about the future of video games. I think so long as regulatory bodies do a competent job of preventing massive monopolies, the struggles of Microsoft point to that currently, then there will be enough competition to go around. The free market will allow indies to continue to exist, and gamers will be spoiled for choices. What could be more alarming, I believe, is the future of many of those who work in the industry directly. The game industry is a beacon to many young creatives and the artsy types who aspire beyond a menial job. I'm not sure if the amount of studios and designers are sustainable. Even more so, the games media that orbits it. Market forces will have to balance that out eventually. In that sense, I am quote unquote worried about the literal future of the industry. Other than that, games will be fine." This is very interesting. I've never really thought about the possibility. Well, I just don't. Is this something that you think should be worried about? Reading this, I'm not quite sure exactly what he means. Of course, we don't have him here with us to sort of explain what his worry is. But I think that video games becoming bigger and bigger will really only mean that there will be more places for people to work, and maybe I'm being a little more optimistic than like the current moment is reflecting, with basically every fucking corporation laying off part of their thing, studios being closed. But I think the industry will only grow and become more popular as it exists over time. And so if someone is looking for a job or a creative opportunity, I think there will only end up being more places making games and designing and being involved in them going into the future.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about this. I'm just gonna pretend you didn't say anything about the games media because I think that's a whole different 90-minute conversation.
Sure.
So I'm not even gonna bring that
Sorry,
up.
Andrew.
But
I can bleep out that part of my reading of the comment.
yeah, I think that the average um, game developer, or just, and I mean that in the most broad sense of game developer,
Yeah.
because I know some people try to like put parameters around what a game developer is, but I mean people who work on games.
Yeah.
I think that they need to be advocated for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so quick to jump to the industry needs to unionize solely because of how global it is. I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
how legitimately feasible
Yeah. International unions and stuff.
I
Yeah.
don't even really know if those exist or how they would work because unions are very much like a
The only experience we have with unions is hearing about the WGA strike and watching How Green Was My Valley.
right. So, but I think workers need to be advocated for a little bit more,
Yeah.
and I like hearing about companies that are like it. This is actually seemingly more of like a Japanese phenomenon to just raise salaries for all of your workers across the board. Um, like Bandai did that after Elden Ring was so successful. I think like 13% raise to every just like 13. Everyone just makes 13% more. Um, I think that stuff is really important because the sort of in the trenches worker is pivotal. When a game when hundreds and hundreds of people are needed to make a game, that means that when we talk about The Last of Us, we're talking about Neil Druckmann. Well, Neil Druckmann needed all those hundreds and hundreds of people, right? So
Of
we need to
course.
take really good care
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously, when you hear about things like crunch and you hear about issues of overwork in various ways, it's clear that we need to advocate for the rights of that worker more than we do, maybe.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's also cool to hear about places like Motion Twin, which are co-ops, so it's employee owned and everyone splits some of that profit. Obviously, that's not feasible in these larger AAA places, but I think the point remains that we need to always be watching out for the worker. Um,
Yeah.
leftist core Abram coming out for a moment
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to that point. I also don't trust uh, the ability of regulatory bodies to stop these monopolies where they might occur.
Yeah.
We made a video about the Activision merger a very, very long time ago where I think I was positive on it. I'm very, very nervous about the idea of an Activision merger now.
Sure.
I'm generally worried about the idea of the industry monopolizing because I do think that begins to give too much power to something like these entities that could start to push an indie out of the space.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm not. I'm also, and this started a whole different conversation in our discords. I'm not even going to broach it really, but I'm also not a believer that like the free market is going to regulate games.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to the fact, the overarching point for me, that I think there's a lot of economic concerns around how the industry operates. I think there's economic concerns
Yeah.
around budgets and time scale for games. I think workers' rights is something that the industry needs to reconcile with, and I think that monopoly is another pressing issue. So this is a whole different conversation, I think, but I am
Yeah.
part of my major concern about the future of games, where it lies, is in the economic construction of the whole space.
Yeah, I'm in the exact same boat because when you pitched this idea to me, it was initially coming off of the conversation that you and I were having about being positive about the current state of games in general, and me coming down on a more positive side than I felt you were. There was a little disconnect there, but then I was thinking to myself as we were sort of bringing in outside comments, where do my problems lie or my positives, and why don't I share the same kind of worries that it seems like a lot of people do? I mean, in our comments here, we actually had to trim some parts because they were a little bit repetitive in terms of people saying similar things about microtransactions and botched launches and DLC and down the line we've talked about. And again, at the beginning, as I said, my distance from those, them being those, most of those kind of games being games I don't play personally, is why, like, on a very like subjective experiential level, these things aren't harming my experience with games. But I think on a like my level of education and understanding about the world level, I I don't know enough about economics to have these elements feel like personally dangerous to me. I take the word of people who do understand these things better and say that they are bad for the industry. I believe that to be true, but on like a subjective level, I don't know enough about what's true about these things or what would be better if these choices were made to like fight for it myself. And so I don't find myself thinking about it very
Yeah,
often, though that is becoming more and more prevalent for me to think about as companies, uh, publishers, game developers that I have personal experience with become embroiled in these kind of issues that really started with the Microsoft acquisition um, of not Blizzard. Wait, it was Bethesda a few years ago. Sorry,
right.
God, I'm getting Blizzard and Bethesda mixed up in my head. Where companies purchasing companies and fucking Embracer Group and Tencent and these giant things buying up corporations. And not only that, but companies preparing themselves to be acquired has become something that I've been thinking about more and more often. Something like Square selling IDOS and IDOS Montreal and the
IO,
other IO. Well, no, IO just left, I think. That there's another Crystal, IDOS and Crystal.
right. And
Square
Embracer
got rid
has
of
those
both of
now,
them.
I believe.
Exactly, but they got rid of them, and Square is preparing itself and reshaping its corporate structure in order for the possibility of being bought by a larger entity. And even something
Right.
like Sony making like very explicit economic decisions, like closing down studios that aren't fitting their vision of what a game
Pixel
should be under
Opus.
their Pixel Opus is exactly. These are things that I'm like, wait, I played Concrete Genie. I I liked the Tomb Raider reboot. These are things that are shaped by the culture that they're in, and now because of the economic realities, they're being either completely gotten away of or reshapen to fit a different kind of economic model. And again, I don't know enough to like worry about it on like a larger scale, what each of these elements or like changes would really impact. But it's starting to creep more and more into like my thought about the games industry. And so I can see myself when I am the experience level and frankly age of some of the people that we're talking about here having a larger worry about those things. But as it stands now, I just graduated from college a fucking week ago, like
Right.
literally less than a week ago. No, exactly a week ago. It's fucking Saturday today. Where I just don't have the experience or knowledge to worry about these things because I haven't been on this goddamn planet long enough, or been thinking about the games industry long enough to like remember when things were different or see the real impact of these changes.
Well, I think even from a consumer side, like the fact that Starfield's only coming to Xbox is ultimately completely arbitrary.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
now obviously these deals have existed on a smaller scale forever, right? And Nintendo even used to do things like back in the NES era, they used to say you could only publish 5 games under your company per year with us.
yeah.
So like
And some companies would make sub companies
yeah.
and pretend that they're other fucking corporations. Yeah,
So there's always been like economic things around the games industry to discuss, but like from a consumer side, imagine if Square Enix gets bought. Imagine
yeah,
they get bought by Sony. Think about how many great Square Enix games come to Nintendo and how
yeah,
much Nintendo stimulates their business. Imagine if their games are only on PlayStation platforms. That doesn't benefit the consumer, right? And
yeah.
sometimes I feel like people who don't understand the economics of games like talk about games economically in like a fanboyish way that I don't think is right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Like the number of fanboy people who talk about the Activision deal through like fanboy terms. I'm like, well, there's so much more going on here than like the console war.
Hmm.
And I'm in a similar boat to you. Where like I think I probably know more about the stuff than you do, but we both
Yeah,
know
probably.
way less about it than like adults.
Yeah,
You know.
exactly.
So like there is so much for me to still learn, even if I feel like I have a cursory understanding of it. But I don't like the way people talk about it sometimes. Of like, oh yeah, Xbox needs to buy these guys, but then that means okay, so now Sony needs to go buy these guys. I'm like, guys, you're talking about an amount of money that's incomprehensible, and you're talking about it
Yeah.
in a way that's not considering how everybody else is going to be affected by these arbitrary decisions. So
Hmm.
I think the economics of the industry will be very, very interesting to watch.
Absolutely. And that's sort of where I come down on the economic side. As I learn more, my thought process on these things will become more and more crystallized, but I can't share thoughts that I don't have. And so when I'm bringing my perspective to it, it is mostly through the lens of I don't quite understand this fully, but from what I do know, these elements seem to be worrisome. These elements seem to be actually maybe healthier than people are giving them credit for. I think we've reached an interesting place. But on like it's very subjective level, I don't feel like I have too much power over any of this. So
Yeah,
I like to just observe and critique where I feel critiquing is necessary. But I err on the side of hopefulness and positivity with the idea that things can change for the better and that there are elements of current games culture that are positive. And I think if we want to get into our last two comments that are sort of, again, bring this to a more
yeah,
positive end, we've got Phil here. He
the
says,
pill.
his Phil, quote unquote, the pill, whatever that means. Does that mean like that he's just like kind of a curmudgeon?
No,
Maybe.
this is his full name.
The pill is his last name.
No, that is his middle name.
I got it.
Phil
Got it.
Pill.
Phil Pill says, going for an optimistic note. I think the future of games is bright because in the past 5 years, it's hit a massive audience of creative fans and the current/future developers who will continue to innovate regardless of the difficulty in the business environment. Companies like Bethesda, EA, Activision, and other AAA houses may all be dropping the ball on true innovation in favor of blatant monetization, but the fact of the matter is that the gaming industry has always been full of tough stuff to navigate. Whether it was a bunch of movie tie-ins, licensing trash from the 80s and 90s, continuing into the 2000s easily onto 7th gen systems, uh, or the shovelware bloat on online storefronts of the 2010s. Meanwhile, independent gaming has really blossomed, similar to the way independent film did in the 90s. With enough dedication, a small team can make something amazing that can be appreciated by millions. I think this is where the future of the industry lies. The Activisions of the world will grow old and set in their ways, but their parent companies will be on the lookout for teams and studios to fund in order to capture the vast segment of the market that wants creativity and fun. I love this. This is a top tier fucking comment right here.
I think this most closely aligns with how I feel about the overarching topic.
Yes. And I'm going to share a little bit about myself when you shut up. Continue.
Yeah, because as I've said, I'm very concerned about sort of the business and economic side of things. But Phil's right in that the games that are most successful in the industry are not AAA.
Well,
It's but you gotta think about it. Among Us, Fall Guys, Hello Neighbor, things like this have sold way more units than the majority of AAA games,
yeah,
and they've
yeah,
done so from much, 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 much smaller budgets, and they come at it from much, much, much more interesting, creative angles. Even if I don't really play any of those games,
yeah.
the truth is the small game, the indie game, often is the most successful game.
Yeah.
And
Especially when you're comparing it to scale, something like the success of
yeah,
Undertale or Stardew Valley or, God forbid, fucking Minecraft. It really shows that even the biggest things, well, I think there's a more interesting competition right now
yeah.
between a smaller team making an uber successful taking over the world game like Among Us versus Call of Duty releasing in that same year and having this basically the same amount of mind share. I mean, that just would not have happened in previous eras of time when indie games either didn't exist because the tools weren't accessible enough, or the concept of digital storefronts and a small team making a game wasn't popular enough to where in the late 2000s we were starting to get indie games, but they weren't capturing that same mind share that they are now, competing with the biggest games from the biggest publishers and the biggest teams.
I'm right that It Takes Two won Game of the Year, right?
It did, yeah, yeah,
See, things like that are so important, in my opinion, so important. And this, it does open up, which I don't even want to get into, but the whole other can of worms of what's actually indie? What are these
yes,
how are indie developers in some ways like cannibalizing each other and taking each other's space and casting a shadow over one another, but discounting, again, as Phil is saying, those business realities. The fact that quote unquote smaller games now hold the same weight in the mind share of your average player is so important. And
yeah,
it's why, even though I might sometimes sound like I'm very pessimistic about the overarching space, in every year I walk away with an armful of games from disparate teams across
yeah,
scales of the industry that provide something truly new. Because as Phil is saying, that space is there for them to make that, but there's also the attention around people to appreciate it.
yeah.
The
Which
appreciate
has only been cultivated larger and larger over the years.
Yeah, and the ability of anybody to share their perspectives on games allows things to be uplifted and for us to find gems. And Among Us is only as big as it is because of like social media.
Yeah,
Point,
that game came out 2 years
yeah,
before the social realities. I think are combined with the economic realities of the current gaming sphere. I think are where I find the most optimism.
yeah,
Is there are absolutely negative sides to things like Steam being open to anyone, the App Store being flooded to the bottom in terms of anyone releasing anything on there trying to get a quick buck. The Switch storefront is fucking notorious for
it's
that. I mean, all
awful.
of them are. But I think that for me, I I take the pros with those cons. I think the idea of being able to have someone publish their own game or get their own game out to the masses, even if no one's going to buy it, or no one does buy it. I think that that is a strength that I think benefits creativity, smaller teams, a wider breadth of games that keeps me from worrying too much about all these other kind of economic realities. I recognize the cons, but I think that the pros greatly outweigh them on a very subjective level because I really like the current state that we're in of the breadth of the industry. I played more microscopically tiny games last year and gigantic fucking huge budget games last year than I ever had in my life. And I think that only becomes more and more true as more people learn to make games and the biggest games keep getting bigger and the smallest games like itch.io keep getting smaller. That is a wider breadth of creative vision that can be delivered. I mean, you might criticize something like the latest Call of Duty game or biggest Activision EA fucking whatever game for not being a creative vision, but in terms of experience, a different kind of way to reinvent interactivity and or continue the same trends of interactivity, we're getting those on the biggest and smallest scales and everything in between than we ever have before. And that is, I think that's the most important thing for the games industry. And frankly, why I find current gaming more personally appealing and gratifying than I do, even though I love games history, going back and playing games from past eras, is there wasn't that big of a gap between the smallest game and the biggest game. It was smaller. There was less people making games. Today, I can find enough games today on the storefront that came out within the last year to last me 5 years. And I find that to be very, very personally satisfying, especially because on a very subjective level, I prefer the game design philosophies of many modern games versus the older games. But that variety, the idea that someone can make a game like Pac-Man or Mario Brothers or something that came out in the older days now, or make something like fucking Elden Ring or God of War Ragnarok now, which could not have been made in the past, makes me appreciate this current era more than on a very subjective level I do previous generations, because there's just so much more that can be done because technology has evolved. The artistic visions have branched and fractured in all sorts of different areas. Even if the biggest ones are the same, there's so much more out there that isn't that biggest stuff, because we've reached this point of anyone being able to make a game in small scale and big scale sort of existing simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it really well. I don't really have a whole lot more to add than that.
Well, we got one more comment though.
Yeah.
You rat bastard.
Where is it?
Jace Thomas.
Jace Thomas. You want to read mine too?
By all means.
By all means, me.
Yes.
Jace says, am I worried about the future of games? Honestly, no. I think there are going to be some large companies like EA and Ubisoft who attempt to go down the path of heavily using AI, NFT, and other blockchain tech in their games.
Oh, Jesus. Foam Stars.
Yeah.
If Foam Stars is their fucking NFT game, oh, God.
Do we know if it is or not? I don't think it is.
No, we don't. We just came up with
Yeah.
that.
But I don't think all companies will. For instance, I feel Nintendo has been very consistent with straying away from these conversations and keeping their games fun without unnecessary microtransactions. We will always have indie and other third-party developers releasing beautifully crafted experiences too. Overall, I think we'll all be able to find new games we love years down the line and ignore the ones we don't. I don't think we're going to be entering this Ready Player One-esque dystopian universe where all video games are riddled with ads and microtransactions and controlled by one or two big corporations. I don't have my glasses on, so it's a little, I'm like,
What does it say? Does it say don't or does?
Yeah, I think Jace makes a great point.
Is that your analysis?
I do want to shout out Nintendo, as I always do.
Shout out.
For as many issues as I have with some facets of how Nintendo operates, some of the games they put out, there's no doubt that they are maybe the last bastion of how things used to be in terms of like business.
Shitty online.
In terms of business strategy. But I do think there's something to learn from them. I really do, in terms of saying, hey, we're going to release our games and make sure they hold value. And we're going to sometimes make sure everything we want in the game is going to be there right away. Yeah. They're at least not going to, to use the verbiage of some of our commenters, nickel and dime us, right?
Yeah.
And they are going to innovate. Nintendo's always innovating, for the most part. There's exceptions, but you look at the overarching trajectory, I think the reason that Nintendo is always going to be around is because they're always going to be this force that is very traditional in a lot of business models that work, but very innovative on a design level. And I think that fusion is beautiful. And I'm really happy that even when they do something more modern, like Nintendo Switch Online, they do it in their own way. And you're not seeing...
You're not seeing all the games be added at once.
You're not seeing Paper Mario the Origami King go to Nintendo Switch Online.
Sure, yeah,
because
absolutely.
PlayStation is almost saying, hey, the subscription model is something we now need to grapple with. We have to do it too. And Nintendo's saying, well, we'll do something, but we're going to keep marching, right? Yeah. And they're just one of many companies that are holding course. And so I find it hard to be pessimistic about the overarching game space when some of the issues we're talking about here, budgets, monetization strategies, various things don't apply at all to Nintendo, and they have such
No.
a
Largely. I mean,
largely.
something like Tears of the Kingdom taking 7 years to make, that is bigger than any previous Zelda game. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet launching in the most broken state. There are elements of Nintendo that are mirroring what has happened elsewhere,
That's
but
fair.
largely, I think, is a way to describe it.
Even in Tears of the Kingdom, they're saying, "Hey, we're going to put the price up, but here's why," and people are going to pay for it. They're going to give the dev team an entire extra year to polish. Right? You're right. There are exceptions like Scarlet and Violet, but for the most part, this big section of the industry, in terms of financial power and critical acclaim and everything, is a holdout for all these issues. And they're attracting
Yeah,
indies and third parties who are exactly the same philosophy. So many of the issues we talked about here do not apply at all to the Nintendo Switch ecosystem,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Indie to Nintendo, and I think that's quite beautiful. And that's part of the reason why I do love playing in that space.
Yeah, I think that something I've never really thought about before is how Nintendo pushes the industry in waves. I think that when we think about modern Nintendo history, starting with the mid 2000s with the Wii and the DS, those were the two most highest selling consoles of all time alongside the PS2 at that point in time.
Yeah.
And it may not continue to today, a lot of the things that they were able to push the industry with, but we saw both Sony and Microsoft in that time copy the piss out of Nintendo. We got the Kinect, we got PlayStation Move, we got the PSP, we got the Vita alongside the 3DS. These companies were seeing the unfathomable, almost uncontested historical success of Nintendo in that era and learning from them in ways that didn't like change the industry forever until today, but changed the industry in a way that disrupted the pattern that those companies were holding at. And I think this is, I think, the last note of future projection. But the Switch is that. The Switch is it doesn't need to be the highest power 4K 60 FPS graphics. It can be a hybrid, which had never really been done before. It can have this different focus on multiplayer games and local multiplayer and the split Joy-Con being a new way of using controllers that we can see in some ways influencing the rest of the industry in a way that is pushing things forward. Steam would not have made a Steam Deck if the Nintendo Switch was not the biggest, well, top five highest selling console of all time when they started developing it. Number three now. Who knows if it'll reach the other slots? I personally kind of doubt it. But and even Sony making their dumb fuck Q Lite that looks like a piece of shit, that would not happen if Nintendo had killed their handheld vector. And 3DS did fine, but then the Switch was just a home console. Okay, handheld gaming is kind of dead, whatever. Sony's not going to do that. And I think that with the popularity of the Switch and the future projection of their Nest console kind of probably being something similar, and it probably also being very successful, we will see that have ramifications across the industry through time. We're seeing more and more dedicated handheld systems come out now that are like PCs or cloud streaming devices than we have in decades.
Yeah.
And that is Nintendo pushing things forward because they're not listening to what everyone else is doing. And so I think that even though it feels like Nintendo is in their own sphere, there are very clear examples of where their success has broken out of their own sphere, the Switch is included, where it has been, is, and will be impacting the way that everyone else is working into the future.
Yeah, they're the most prolific, and the success of Switch is so important because, like, it seemed like maybe with the Wii U, maybe people were just tired of it, how Nintendo
Yeah.
operates, and they were just done with it. But that's obviously not the case because what Nintendo does is so timeless. And the Switch reiterates all these things. They reiterate you can innovate in ways that aren't graphical.
Mm-hmm.
You can drive the profit you need off of releasing really solid games that hold their value. You can show that big single player experiences sell. You can explore these different scales of development. You don't have to fill your games with these microtransactions or whatever that people might be experimenting with elsewhere. They are a sort of a reminder that all this is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the reason why they stick around.
Yeah.
And of course, their IP is just stronger than everybody else's IP, so that allows them to do things that others can't. But I think that some of Nintendo's success on the most sort of ideological level is replicable. Big, interesting single player games sell. Local multiplayer sells. Joy sells. So many of the most popular indie games are sort of Nintendo-like. Fall Guys is very Nintendo.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They have these lessons that rise to the top of the industry and eschew a lot of the issues we're talking about. So, as usual, everyone should just listen to Nintendo. That's the moral of today's story, I think.
Well, also listen to us.
Listen to us.
Because basically, we're really the Nintendo of the online gaming conversation sphere.
Are we?
In many ways. Yeah, we're handheld.
We're Japanese? Nope. Okay, you ready?
I was born for it.
Here we go.
I believe this is my ultimate purpose. I think much like a bee dying after it has sex, I will perish.
The bees don't die after they have sex. They die after they sting. Well, I guess and after sex.
No, I'm pretty sure the worker bees die after inseminating the queen.
Yeah, they do, but they also die when they sting.
Well, I've never stung before.
That's why wasps are crazy.
Sex.
Because wasps can sting many times.
Wow. That's so cool of them.
No, it's not. Or hornets.
Hornets.
Okay.
I can't wait for oh god. B-log banter.
Beehive banter.
Beehive banter, sure.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your Doomin. Do you mind?
What? I'm just having fun with myself, okay?
No, I messed up. I figured I'd make it your fault. Third time's a charm.
Oh, I see. Okay.